They buried a man alive for 4 hours in a wooden coffin under 6 feet of Australian dirt, and when the United Nations found out, they tried to ban it as torture. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. Australia looked the UN straight in the eye and said, no, not just no, hell no, and they're still doing it right now. Today, this very moment, somewhere in Western Australia, there's a soldier lying in a box underground, zip-tied, breathing through a garden hose, wondering if today is the day the instructors forget about him. You think you know what Special Forces training looks like? Navy SEALs, British SAS, Russian Spetsnaz. Forget everything you've seen, because what the Australian SASR does goes so far beyond the line that every other Western military backed away in horror. The British banned it in 1978. The Americans won't touch it. The Israelis think it's excessive, but Australia, they doubled down, made it harder, made it mandatory. And here's what really keeps me up at night. It works. We have the proof, we have the statistics, we have the combat reports from operators who survived Taliban captivity because of what happened to them in that coffin. But we also have the psychiatric casualties, the phobia victims, the 23% who press the panic button and fail, the 7% who never fully recover. So what happens inside that box? What do they do to break a man's mind so completely that enemy torture feels like relief? Why does Australia defend a practice the entire world condemns? And most disturbing of all, what does this training create? Elite warriors prepared for the worst, or something darker that contributed to the war crimes that shocked the world in 2020? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is going to change everything you thought you knew about military training, human limits, and the terrifying question nobody wants to answer. How do you prepare someone for torture without torturing them? And should you even try? This is the story they don't want told. The training the UN tried to bury, and the soldiers who went into the ground and came back different. Watch till the end, because the truth is buried deeper than any coffin. Swanbourne Barracks, Western Australia. The year is 2003. A Special Forces candidate lies inside a wooden coffin. His hands are zip-tied behind his back, wrists already chafing against the plastic restraints. Instructors hammer the lid shut above him, each blow of the hammer driving nails through plywood, sealing him inside. The box is lowered into a freshly dug hole. Shovels of red Australian earth fall onto the wood. First a drum beat, then a muffled thud, then silence. Through a garden hose breathing tube, the only connection to the world above, he hears a final instruction from somewhere in the fading light. Taliban buries prisoners alive. You have 4 hours to decide if you want to go down in a hole or give up your mates. Good luck. This is the Australian SASR's resistance to interrogation training. And in 2004, the United Nations tried to make it illegal. The coffin measures 180 centimeters long, 60 centimeters wide, 45 centimeters deep. Standard coffin proportions, plywood construction with a reinforced lid, a single breathing tube installed, 5 centimeters in diameter, garden hose, quality. A medical sensor taped to his chest monitors heart rate and breathing patterns. The candidate inspected this box 30 minutes ago, knowing full well he would soon be inside it. He watched the instructors dig the hole, 1.2 meters deep, wide enough for the coffin, with room for packed earth around the sides. He was told about the panic button under his left thumb. Press it, you fail. You're withdrawn from selection, you never come back. The choice is simple in theory, impossible in practice. But this brutality has roots that stretch back decades, carved into Australian military doctrine by prisoners who broke and prisoners who didn't. Korea, 1950 to 1953. 29 Australian prisoners of war captured by Chinese and North Korean forces, subjected to systematic torture that went far beyond physical beatings. Starvation rations, isolation cells, psychological warfare designed to shatter the mind before the body gave out. 21 of them broke under interrogation. They revealed troop positions, tactical information, details that could cost other soldiers their existence. 8 passed away in captivity, some from the torture itself, others from simply giving up mentally, surrendering to despair in those concrete cells. The post-war lesson was brutal and clear. Physical toughness means nothing if your mind breaks. You can run 30 kilometers with a full pack. You can shoot expert on the range. You can scale walls and swim rivers. None of it matters when a man with pliers and a blowtorch asks you where your patrol is heading next. Vietnam adapted these lessons with fresh horror. The SASR deployed to Vietnam from 1966 onward, entering a jungle war where capture meant something worse than ending. Viet Cong torture methods were documented, cataloged, studied. Bamboo cage imprisonment, sometimes for weeks in spaces too small to stand or lie flat. Burial in confined spaces used to disorient and terrify, breaking the prisoner's sense of time and space. Mock executions with rifles pressed to skulls, blank rounds or live ammunition, the prisoner never knowing which until the trigger pulled. The psychological damage often proved more lasting than physical wounds. Men came back from those jungles changed, hollowed out, carrying memories that no debriefing could erase. The British SAS influence shaped Australia's approach to this problem. The Australians adopted the United Kingdom's resistance to interrogation model, studying what the British had learned through their own bitter experience. The British version from the 1960s included stress positions that left men trembling, sensory deprivation that fractured reality, mock drowning exercises that convinced the body it was ending, but the United Kingdom banned the burial exercise in 1978 after a candidate developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder, psychological damage that never fully healed. The British decided the cost exceeded the benefit. Australia looked at the same data and reached a different conclusion. Keep it, make it harder. The threat hadn't diminished, so neither would the preparation. The SASR selection course runs 21 days. The failure rate exceeds 90%. Most candidates wash out during endurance marches, navigation exercises, physical challenges that push human limits. But resistance to interrogation training comes at day 18, when candidates are already physically and mentally exhausted, running on fumes and willpower. This timing is deliberate. The instructors want to see how men function when there's nothing left in the tank, when comfort and hope are distant memories. 2 hours before the burial, candidates are ambushed during a routine patrol exercise, hoods thrown over heads, hands zip-tied behind backs, bodies hurled into the back of a truck. The transition from training to trauma happens in seconds. They're driven to an interrogation facility, a classified location in the Western Australian bush, where screams carry no further than the nearest eucalyptus trees. The beatings begin immediately. Phone books against ribs and kidneys, implements that leave no visible marks, but transmit pain deep into tissue and bone. 1 hour before burial, the hoods come off in a dimly lit room that smells of sweat and fear. The candidates are shown footage, actual recordings from Afghanistan and Iraq, enemy interrogations, Taliban and ISIS burial videos that circulated on jihadi forums, propaganda meant to terrorize but serving here as education. These are not Hollywood dramatizations, these are real men going into real holes, and the cameras keep rolling until the end. The instructor's message is simple and merciless. This is what waits for you if you're captured. We can't show you how to survive it. We can only show you if you can survive it. The distinction matters. Some men have it, some don't. Better to find out in Western Australia than in Kandahar. Hour 0 arrives. The candidate approaches the coffin. He's already exhausted, already beaten, already terrified. His hands remain zip-tied behind his back, ankles bound together with more plastic restraints. He's placed face up in the box, staring at the plywood lid inches from his face. The panic button explanation comes again. Under your left thumb, one press ends this, one press also ends your career. The instructors lift the lid, 8 nails driven through wood. The sound of hammer on nail is shockingly loud in the confined space, each strike a countdown to darkness. The box is lifted by 4 men, carried to the hole, lowered with ropes. Then the dirt begins to fall. The first shovelful hits the coffin lid with a hollow thud, the second follows, then a third. The candidate can hear every grain of earth, every rock that bounces off the wood, 15 centimeters of dirt, carefully measured. Then the pace quickens, 30 centimeters, 60 centimeters. The sound changes as the earth accumulates, muffling, dampening, until finally all external noise vanishes completely. He lies in absolute darkness, breathing through a plastic tube, feeling the weight of Australia itself pressing down on his wooden prison. The temperature inside begins to rise immediately. Body heat combines with earth insulation, creating a sauna effect. 35 degrees Celsius, 40 degrees, sweat soaks his uniform within minutes. The first 30 minutes are the worst. Medical data from a 2012 study shows heart rate spiking to 140, 160 beats per minute, the acute panic phase. Every instinct screams to move, to fight, to escape, but movement is impossible. The zip ties ensure that. Hyperventilation sets in, breathing coming fast and shallow through the tube. Claustrophobia wraps around the mind like a fist, squeezing, crushing. Some candidates scream during this phase. The instructors above hear nothing or choose to hear nothing. The earth swallows sound along with light. Hour 1 to hour 2 brings dissociation. The darkness is absolute total, a blackness so complete it feels physical. Sensory deprivation begins its work, fracturing the boundary between real and imagined. Time perception collapses. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like days. The mind, desperate for input, begins manufacturing its own. Hallucinations start as whispers, auditory first, voices calling from far away, digging sounds that may be real or phantom. Then visual patterns emerge from the darkness, geometric shapes and shifting colors where no light exists. Faces appear, family members, friends, enemies. The candidate knows intellectually these are hallucinations, knows his brain is simply filling the sensory void, but knowing doesn't make them disappear. Some report tactile hallucinations during this phase, the sensation of insects crawling across skin, the feeling of suffocation even while breathing normally through the tube, the mind's rebellion against its circumstances, but the psychological warfare from above hasn't even begun. Hour 2 to hour 3 is when instructors intervene not to rescue but to torment. Cold water suddenly pours through the breathing tube without warning. The candidate chokes, gags, convinced he's drowning. The water stops as abruptly as it started. Minutes pass or hours. Time has no meaning here. Then sounds from above, digging, the scrape of shovels against dirt. Hope surges, desperate and painful. They're coming to get me. It's over. The sounds reach the coffin. Knuckles rap against the wooden lid. 3 sharp knocks. Then silence, then the sound of dirt being shoveled back onto the box. It was a test, a cruel joke, a reminder that rescue is a gift, not a right. Voices whisper through the breathing tube. You've been down 20 minutes. The lie is obvious to anyone with a functioning sense of time, but time doesn't function down here. The candidate's internal clock shattered an hour ago. How long has it actually been? 20 minutes? 2 hours? 6 hours? Your mate's already quit. You're the last one, another lie, but how can he know for certain? Maybe he is the last. Maybe everyone else was smarter, pressed the button, chose survival over pride. We're going to leave you overnight. This lie is the cruelest because it's the most believable. What if they do? What if something happens above ground? An emergency, a vehicle accident, a base alarm? What if they simply forget? The panic button throbs under his thumb like a second heartbeat. Temptation and shame wrapped together. Hour 3 to hour 4 is where men either break or transform. Those who pass report something the psychologists call ego destruction. The self dissolves. Personal identity fragments. There's no longer a name, a rank, a history. There's only breath and darkness, and the choice to continue breathing. Some describe it as spiritual, a confrontation with mortality so direct it becomes transcendent. Others describe it in simpler terms. I decided I would survive this or perish trying. There was no middle ground. Medical monitoring shows something remarkable during this phase. Heart rates actually drop, 90 to 100 beats per minute. The body, having exhausted panic, settles into acceptance. Not resignation, but adaptation. The organism learning in real time that the situation, however intolerable, is survivable. The extraction begins without warning. Digging sounds from above, real this time. 3 to 5 minutes of scraping, deliberately slow. The final stress test. The lid opens. Sunlight, even the filtered light of late afternoon, is blinding after hours of absolute darkness. But there's no comfort in the light. A hood drops over the candidate's face immediately. No confirmation of how much time has passed, no reassurance that the ordeal has ended. He's lifted from the box, his legs buckling, muscles locked from immobility, carried, dragged, pushed into another room, the interrogation room. Because the burial was never the end point. It was preparation for what comes next. This is the critical insight that outsiders miss when they condemn the exercise. The burial isn't torture for torture's sake. It's recalibration. By the time the candidate reaches the interrogation room, he's already experienced what he believes is the worst-case scenario. Everything that follows, the beatings, the stress positions, the sleep deprivation, the mock executions, all of it feels like relief compared to the coffin. The psychological principle is brutal in its elegance. Everything is bearable after the box. Stress positions, wall sitting or arm extension for up to 4 hours and become merely uncomfortable. White noise and strobe lights, sensory overload after sensory deprivation become almost mundane. Mock executions with blank rounds pressed to the skull are just another test. The interrogators offer choices. Give us intelligence or we put you back in the box. The threat is real. The box still exists just outside, waiting. Some men break here, most don't. They've already survived their personal apocalypse. What's a few more hours of discomfort? The passing requirement is simple. Provide only name, rank, service number, date of birth, the Geneva Convention minimum. Resist for the full duration. No time limit given to the candidate, but the actual duration runs 4 to 6 hours total. Maintain mental coherence throughout. Checked via questioning designed to assess psychological state. Can you count backwards from 100? What's your mother's name? Where were you born? These aren't intelligence questions. They're sanity checks. The instructors need to know the candidate's mind remains intact, that they haven't created a broken person who only appears functional. But in August 2003, something went wrong. The candidate's identity remains protected, known only as Corporal M, in official documents. Background checks show 6-year service in the Royal Australian Regiment, 1 Afghanistan tour, solid performance record. This was his second attempt at SASR selection. He'd failed the first time during an endurance march, a respectable failure. Physical limits are understandable. This time, he'd made it to day 18, the burial. What happened next would trigger an international incident that echoed for years. The official duration claimed by Corporal M was 8 hours, 20 minutes. The SASR disputes this, insisting it was 4 hours, 30 minutes. The truth may lie somewhere between, obscured by the time distortion inherent to sensory deprivation. What's undisputed is that complications occurred. The medical sensor monitoring his vitals malfunctioned at hour 2. The instructors didn't realize it. They continued verbal checks through the breathing tube. Corporal M stopped responding at hour 3. In any normal circumstance, this would trigger immediate extraction, but the instructors made a judgment call. He's mentally resistant. He's ignoring us deliberately. That's actually a good sign. It shows strength. They continued the exercise. When they finally opened the coffin lid, Corporal M was unconscious, revived after 90 seconds using water to the face and smelling salts. His first words upon regaining consciousness were simple. "I thought you forgot about me." Medical examination showed elevated stress hormones but no physical injury. He was cleared to continue. He completed the full selection course. He passed. By all official metrics, the exercise was a success. Corporal M became an SASR operator. 3 months later, in November 2003, Corporal M was hospitalized following a severe panic attack. The diagnosis came back as severe claustrophobia combined with acute stress disorder. He filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force. The allegations were explosive. The exercise constituted torture under the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The duration exceeded safe limits. Medical monitoring was inadequate. The training violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Geneva Convention. The investigation that followed would drag the SASR's most classified training into international daylight. The Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force launched a full investigation. The findings, released in March 2004, walked a careful legal tightrope. On the torture allegation, the ruling was clear. Training does not meet the definition of torture under the Convention Against Torture. The reasoning relied on 3 pillars. The candidate volunteered. He could quit at any time via the panic button. Medical supervision was present, even if flawed in this specific instance. No permanent physical injury resulted, but the report included a crucial caveat. The exercise exists in a legal gray area. On safety concerns, the investigators were more critical. The medical sensor failure was deemed an unacceptable lapse. The extended duration, whether 4 hours or 8, resulted from equipment failure, leading to time miscalculation. Recommendations followed. Backup monitoring systems. Mandatory dig checks every 30 minutes, regardless of candidate response. The report's conclusion on legality remains controversial. While the exercise causes severe psychological distress, it serves a legitimate military purpose. Operational realities in contemporary conflicts justify extreme training measures. However, the line between preparation and abuse is narrow. The outcome was bureaucratic compromise. The training would continue, deemed operationally necessary, duration officially capped at 4 hours maximum, improved medical monitoring mandated, but the exercise itself, the fundamental act of burying a man alive to test his breaking point, that remained untouched. The United Nations Committee Against Torture entered the picture in 2004 during Australia's periodic review. The Inspector General's investigation report had leaked to media. Australian human rights groups seized the opportunity, submitting formal complaints to the UN committee. The committee's June 2004 report expressed concerns in carefully diplomatic language. The committee expresses concern regarding reports of extreme psychological distress inflicted on military personnel during special forces training, particularly exercises involving simulated burial and prolonged isolation. The committee questions whether such practices, even in a training context, are consistent with Article 16 of the Convention, which prohibits cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The recommendation followed. The state party should review all military training practices to ensure they do not constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment and provide safeguards against abuse. The United Nations didn't ban the practice outright. They lacked the authority to do so, but they came as close as international diplomacy allows to declaring it torture and demanding it stop. The Australian government's response, delivered in September 2004, doubled down on operational necessity. The training was defended as essential for operational effectiveness. The threat was real, documented, ongoing. Taliban and ISIS both use live burial as torture and execution. SASR operators needed preparation for the specific threat. The government pointed to improved safeguards implemented after the 2003 incident. They rejected the UN recommendation to eliminate the exercise entirely. The legal argument Australia presented was technically sound, if morally questionable. The Convention Against Torture applies to persons under detention or control. SASR candidates are volunteers in training, not detained persons. They can withdraw consent at any time through the panic button mechanism. Therefore, the exercise does not constitute torture under the treaty's legal definition. The UN counter-argument presented in their 2008 follow-up review challenged this logic. Consent obtained under duress, specifically the threat of selection failure and career termination, may not constitute genuine consent. Psychological harm remains harm regardless of volunteering status. The stalemate continues to this day. The United Nations lacks enforcement mechanisms beyond recommendations. Australia continues the exercise with modifications. International criticism persists without resolution. What makes the SASR unique is not that they train for capture. Every elite unit does. The distinction lies in method and duration. The United States Navy SEALs undergo SERE school, survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The training includes confined spaces but no burial component. Waterboarding was used until 2007 when CIA scandal politics forced its removal. Metal boxes replaced coffins not buried but confined. Duration maxed at 2 to 3 hours. The British SAS, Australia's doctrinal parent, banned burial exercises in 1978. They substituted sensory deprivation chambers and stress positions extending up to 6 hours. The risk-benefit ratio for actual burial was deemed unjustifiable after psychiatric casualties mounted. Israeli Sayeret Matkal conducts limited burial training, 2 to 3 hours in sand rather than coffins, focused on escape techniques rather than pure psychological resistance. Russian Spetsnaz allegedly conducts unmonitored burial lasting days without medical supervision, though these reports remain unconfirmed and disputed. Australia stands alone among Western democracies in conducting full coffin burial as standard selection procedure, the longest documented duration at 4 hours official policy, though rumors of longer persist, the most formalized program, unchanged in fundamental structure since the 1980s, despite international pressure. This isolation raises the obvious question: why does Australia insist on a practice every ally has abandoned or never adopted? The operational reality argument carries weight, supported by actual battlefield incidents. Afghanistan, 2010. An SASR patrol of 4 operators was ambushed in Uruzgan province. One operator, identity classified, was temporarily captured. 4 hours passed before rescue forces extracted him. Taliban treatment during those 4 hours was documented in post-rescue debriefing. Beaten with rifle butts, multiple impacts to torso and head. Placed in a cramped underground storage room measuring 1 meter by 1 meter by 1.2 meters. Mock execution performed, AK-47 fired next to his head, either blank round or deliberate miss. Interrogated about patrol routes, friendly positions, planned operations. The operator's statement, recorded in 2010 debrief reports, is stark. The room was smaller than the box at Swanbourne. They hit me harder than the instructors, but I knew I could survive it because I'd survived worse in training. The box prepared me. Without it, I would have broken. The result justified SASR command's position. The operator provided only name, rank, and number. He revealed no tactical intelligence. The Taliban learned nothing useful from 4 hours of interrogation and torture. SASR command. Conclusion was immediate and definitive. Training validated. One operator saved the existence of his entire squadron by not revealing patrol patterns under duress. This single incident became the primary justification for continuing the burial exercise despite international condemnation. The argument is simple. The training works. We have proof. Why would we stop? The self-selection mechanism provides another justification supported by statistical analysis. Data from 2008 to 2018, spanning 10 years, shows clear patterns. 1,247 candidates attempted SASR selection during this period. 186 reached the resistance to interrogation burial phase. 85% had already failed earlier selection phases. Of those 186 who entered the coffin, 43 pressed the panic button. A 23% failure rate at this specific phase. 143 completed the burial and continued to full selection. Of those 143 who passed burial, 89 completed full selection successfully, a 62% rate. 54 failed later phases, endurance marches or live fire exercises, claiming them after they'd survived the box. The critical finding from this decade of data is striking. 0% of operators who passed the burial exercise developed post-traumatic stress disorder from the exercise itself. 12% of combat-deployed SASR personnel developed post-traumatic stress disorder from actual operations, a rate comparable to other special forces units. The interpretation offered by SASR command is straightforward. Those who can't handle the box can't handle combat stress. Better they discover their limits in training than in combat where their failure costs other people's existence. An anonymous SASR psychologist speaking in 2015 framed it clinically. We're not trying to traumatize people. We're trying to identify who is already capable of managing extreme trauma. Better they discover their limits in Swanbourne than in Kandahar, where their breakdown endangers teammates. The search for alternatives consumed years and resources. Between 1995 and 2000, multiple experiments attempted to replicate the psychological pressure without physical burial. Test 1 in 1995 used virtual reality simulation. Candidates wore VR headsets showing burial scenarios complete with sound effects and visual darkness. Result: 0% experienced genuine distress. The candidates knew intellectually the threat was simulated. The brain refused to believe danger was real. Conclusion: the threat must be actual for the training to function. Test 2 in 1997 attempted hypnosis-induced stress states, trying to create psychological pressure without physical confinement. Result: ineffective. Candidates reported the experience as interesting, but without lasting impact. No psychological adaptation occurred. Test 3 in 2000 used extended sensory deprivation, 12 hours in an isolation chamber, dark and silent and temperature controlled. Result: less effective than burial. Candidates could move, they felt safe, the existential threat component was absent. Final conclusion: physical confinement is irreplaceable. The body's panic response cannot be adequately simulated through artificial means. Medical data from the Australian Defence Health Sciences longitudinal study, conducted from 2012 to 2016, provides the most comprehensive analysis of burial exercise effects. The study measured outcomes from 186 candidates who underwent the training. Acute effects during and immediately after the exercise showed 82% reported severe distress, an expected finding. 23% met clinical criteria for acute stress response, 7% developed specific phobias, primarily claustrophobia and fear of darkness. Long-term effects measured at 3-year follow-up revealed more nuanced outcomes. Of the 89 who became SASR operators, 0% reported lasting trauma specifically attributable to the burial exercise. 3% reported occasional nightmares within normal range for military personnel. 12% developed combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder from actual operations, not training. Of the 43 who pressed the panic button and failed selection, outcomes diverged. 19% reported persistent anxiety related to confinement. 9% required psychiatric treatment for phobias, but 67% reported no lasting effects whatsoever. For this majority, the failure was embarrassing but not traumatic. They'd tested their limits, found them, and moved on with their military careers in other units. Comparative data from control groups of regular infantry showed 8% developing post-traumatic stress disorder from combat deployment, lower than SASR's 12%, but 34% of regular infantry reported feeling unprepared for the stress of combat, compared to only 2% of SASR personnel. The researchers' conclusion walked a careful line. The training causes measurable psychological harm in some individuals. However, those who pass demonstrate resilience that translates to lower rates of combat stress reactions. The question remains, is that benefit worth the 7% who develop phobias? Then came the Brereton report, and everything changed. The investigation had nothing to do with training initially. In 2016, allegations surfaced of war offenses committed by SASR personnel in Afghanistan, unlawful eliminations of civilians and prisoners, conduct that violated the laws of armed conflict. Major General Paul Brereton was appointed to investigate in 2017. The report, released in 2020, confirmed 39 unlawful eliminations by SASR members. The findings shocked Australia and damaged the regiment's reputation, perhaps irreparably. The media narrative that emerged in 2020 and 21 drew direct lines between training and war offenses. Did brutal training create brutal soldiers? Leaked photographs of burial coffins appeared in ABC News reports in November 2020. Public outcry demanded answers. This is how we create people who commit offenses. But the Brereton report's actual findings on training were more measured. No direct link existed between resistance to interrogation training and war offenses. The report did note a warrior culture within SASR that prioritized lethality over humanity, but couldn't establish causal connection to specific training exercises. The recommendation was diplomatic. Review all training to ensure production of ethical warriors, not merely effective ones. The Australian Defence Force response came in 2020 and 21. An independent review of SASR training methods was commissioned, led by civilian psychologists and ethics experts. This represented the first time in SASR history that outsiders evaluated internal training practices. The review findings, released in 2021 and partially redacted, addressed the burial exercise directly. The exercise serves a legitimate training purpose, preparing operators for potential capture. However, it causes measurable harm to a minority of participants. Most controversially, the review suggested the exercise may contribute to an anything-goes culture within the unit, though the link to actual war offenses remained speculative rather than proven. Recommendations followed. Reduce maximum duration to 4 hours, down from the previous unofficial ceiling of 6+ hours. Improve psychological screening before the exercise to identify at-risk candidates. Add mandatory debriefing and counseling within 48 hours post-exercise. Increase external oversight with medical observers from outside SASR rather than unit medics. One recommendation was explicitly rejected. Complete elimination of the exercise, still deemed operationally essential despite controversy. Current official policy as of 2024 maintains the burial exercise as part of SASR selection. Duration is strictly capped at 4 hours maximum, rigorously enforced. Enhanced medical monitoring includes backup sensors and mandatory visual checks every 30 minutes, regardless of candidate response. Pre-screening for claustrophobia through psychological assessment attempts to filter out vulnerable candidates before the exercise. Post-exercise counseling within 24 hours is mandatory, not optional. But rumors persist. Some candidates report subjective experiences suggesting longer durations, though time distortion makes reliable reporting impossible. No verified reports of official policy violations post-2021 have emerged, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in classified training environments. International reaction in the 2020s revealed growing isolation of Australia's position. New Zealand's Special Air Service publicly stated in 2020 that they do not conduct similar training. They'd removed the burial component from selection in 2001, citing cultural reasons related to Maori burial traditions. The United Kingdom responded through a former SAS commander interviewed by The Times in 2021. We decided in the 1970s that the risks outweighed the benefits. Clearly, Australia disagrees. The statement was diplomatic condemnation wrapped in professional courtesy. The United States Pentagon, when asked about SASR training practices in 2021, offered carefully neutral language. U.S. Special Operations Forces train to SERE standards, which do not include the specific techniques referenced. Translation: we don't do that, and we're not commenting further. Human Rights Watch released a report in 2022 titled Australia's Extreme Military Training Practices, calling for international pressure to ban the burial exercise. The organization lacks legal authority, so the report changed nothing practically. The philosophical divide remains unbridgeable. Supporters argue that warfare is worse than any training simulation. If a candidate cannot survive the coffin in controlled conditions with medical monitoring and a panic button, they certainly cannot survive Taliban captivity where none of those safeguards exist. Better to break someone in Swanbourne than have an enemy break them in Kandahar, where the consequences extend beyond one person's psychological health. Opponents counter that every other Western military achieves elite readiness without burying personnel alive. The practice isn't toughness, they argue, but institutional cruelty disguised as operational necessity. The data supports both positions simultaneously. Operators who pass demonstrably show increased resilience, measured and documented. The exercise also causes lasting harm to some participants, equally measured and documented. Whether the benefit justifies the cost is a value judgment, not a scientific question. An anonymous SASR operator who retired in 2019 after 20 years of service offered his perspective. I was buried in 1999. It was 4 hours, but it felt like 4 days. I hallucinated my own funeral, heard my mother crying. When they pulled me out, I vomited and couldn't stand for 20 minutes. In 2006, I was captured by Taliban for 6 hours. They beat me, threatened to remove my head, locked me in a shipping container in 50-degree heat. And you know what? The box was worse. Not because the box is objectively worse, it's because the box already broke me and rebuilt me. By the time the Taliban had me, I'd already survived my personal end once. They were just late to the party. Do I think the training should continue? I don't know, but I know I'm alive because of it. The question remains unanswerable through logic alone. How do you prepare someone for torture without torturing them? Option 1, don't try. Train physical skills exclusively. Hope psychological resilience emerges naturally through general hardship. Risk: unprepared operators break under interrogation, compromise missions, perish in captivity. Option 2, simulate torture realistically, causing controlled harm and training to prevent greater harm in combat. Risk: traumatize soldiers before they ever encounter actual combat, create institutional culture of brutality. Option 3, select for natural resilience through psychological testing rather than physical ordeal. Risk: tests don't predict real-world performance accurately. False confidence proves deadly. SASR chose option 2. Most militaries chose option 1. No one knows definitively which approach is correct because the sample size of captured Tier 1 operators is thankfully small. The final irony is that the threat SASR trains for is not theoretical or historical. In 2023, ISIS released propaganda footage showing a captured Kurdish fighter being buried alive. In 2024, Taliban executed an Afghan interpreter through live burial. The video circulated on encrypted channels before being removed by platform moderators. The practice continues. The threat remains active, documented, ongoing. The question is not whether the training is extreme. The question is whether the alternative, sending operators into environments where this threat exists without specific preparation, is somehow more ethical. As of 2024, the SASR still buries candidates alive. No Western ally has adopted the practice. The United Nations Committee Against Torture still considers it problematic. Australia still defends it as necessary. 23% of candidates fail this phase. 0% of those who pass report lasting trauma from the exercise itself. 7% develop specific phobias. The debate continues without resolution. They buried him alive for 4 hours. The United Nations called it torture. Australia called it Tuesday.